Thanks for clicking. Is the Bank of Canada's pandemic money printing campaign responsible for our current inflationary environment?
Of course not.
Indeed, if you listen to the Bank of Canada and every analyst that says that inflation was entirely unpredictable, then no, the money printing and subsequent government spending had nothing to do with the continual increase of our prices. A brief read-through of the policy statements over the past 6 months shows a central bank that is adamant that its inflation is due to supply chain issues, Russia, inflation expectations, wage expectations, COVID. But beyond a few mentions of quantitative tightening, the bank makes very few references to the increase of the money supply that we saw throughout the pandemic. But what does the data say? How much money did the Bank of Canada print, and does an increase in the money supply cause inflation?
Yes.
Given that the Bank of Canada says it's going to continue to raise interest rates to get our inflation rate under control, and the news that despite all of the rate hikes, Canada's economy is still running hot, it's worth taking a look at the data to see how we arrived at this current situation. So what I want to do today is go over a brief discussion of why money printing is thought to cause inflation, look at how much money the Bank of Canada printed during the pandemic and how much that increased the money supply, discuss how increases in the money supply have affected the inflation rates in the past and whether or not it was predictable it would have affected them this time, and then discuss what to look for next. Stats Canada is set to release the inflation data mid-next week, which should give us a good idea on how high the Bank of Canada will have to go to get this inflation rate under control. We'll obviously have an update out on that rate on this channel. Click like and subscribe to get those updates, but for now, let's get into inflation. Very briefly, as we all know, inflation is an increase in prices. You go to the grocery store, a can of coffee costs you $2 more than it did last year. That's inflation. But how does money printing, how does an increase in the money supply cause inflation? If we have two people, say Nick and Jen, and they both have $5 and they both want half of a pizza, no problem, they each get half of a pizza, each piece costs $5. But let's say they're each given an additional $5 by Governor Tiff Macklem, who drops the money off, and now they each have $10, and still there is only one pizza. Since there is no more food, no more additional production, no more choices in food, just an increase in money, both Nick and Jen can only buy half of that pizza, which now costs $10. It's the same amount of pizza going to Nick and Jen. That same amount just costs more. Their dollars are worth less relative to pizza. This is a very crude example, but you get the idea. And the Bank of Canada said as such in a 2001 study, noting persistent deviations of money from long-term money demand are associated with significant changes in inflation. Or, when the money supply falls, so too does inflation. When the money supply increases, so too does inflation. So how much did Canada increase its money supply throughout the pandemic?
I think a lot.
Now, the money supply within an economy does grow naturally. It does ebb and flow throughout time. If we look at the 22 years prior to the pandemic, the 22 years of data available on the Bank of Canada's website, we see that the money supply ebbs and flows since 1996, with the three measures of money supply averaging between 7 and 9% year-over-year growth. We had a few brief blips throughout this period where the money supply expanded over and above the norm, but basically we're around 7 to 9% increases in the money supply over the past 20 years. Then COVID hits in February of 2020 and the money supply surges upward, increasing at a higher annual rate than it had over the past 22 years that the Bank of Canada has available. In February of 2020, Canada's M2, a broad-based measure of our money supply, stood at $1.819 trillion. By February of 2022, it stood at $2.352 trillion. That's a 23% increase in our money supply in 2 years. Indeed, by February of 2021, Canada's M2 had hit an annual growth rate of 14%, the highest since May of 1980. As a side note, in 1981, 1 year following that 14% expansion in the money supply, our inflation rate hit 12.5%. Our prime rate hit 22.75% soon thereafter. Fast forward to January of 2022, and it was being reported that 1 out of every 5 Canadian dollars in circulation didn't exist 2 years prior. And although the government was spending the money, the Bank of Canada was printing it, or creating it.
Well, that's a very fine distinction.
If we look at the Bank of Canada's asset sheet, that is, everything they've purchased, and we look back to 1980, we can see that their assets remain relatively stable going on 40 years. Then it explodes in 2020, with the bank holding about $118 billion in assets, and then $560 billion in assets just 1 year later. So we have about a $400 billion increase in the amount of money created or printed by the Bank of Canada within the period of a year. And it wasn't just Canada. The United States added $6 trillion to its money supply as well within the period of about 2 years, with their previous $6 trillion that was added to their own money supply taking about 9 years. By February of 2021, the Wall Street Journal was noting that the United States had expanded its money supply at the fastest pace since World War II. So we have the US increasing its money supply at the fastest rate since the war, Canada increasing its money supply at the fastest rate since 1980, right before inflation and interest rates went sky high. Is it possible that this massive increase in the money supply was enough to at least partially cause some of the inflation that we're seeing right now?
Yeah?
Indeed, and although the Russian invasion of Ukraine wasn't predictable, the increase in the money supply causing higher than normal inflation was entirely predictable. Throughout 2020 and 2021, there was a flood of predictions out there warning that these increases in the money supply would cause prices to go up higher. We saw warnings in March, April, May, and June of 2021. But the warnings weren't coming from the Bank of Canada. The bank was warning in July of 2021 that Canadians shouldn't overreact from the high inflation that we're seeing. At that point, inflation was 3.1%. Also of note, in June of 2021, the percentage of buyers using variable rate mortgage jumped to over 50%, the highest since their use started being tracked. So, while the Bank of Canada was warning Canadians not to overreact to inflation, we did have a number of warnings out there that the increase in the money supply would increase the cost of goods. And this is by no means to say that the increase in the money supply wasn't necessary, or that at least a lot of it was, as we faced a once-in-a-generation pandemic. But for us to completely ignore the amount of new money that entered into circulation, the amount of new money that was created or printed out of thin air, to ignore that fact when trying to assess how long and how high this inflation will go, is insane. If we could just create $400 billion every 2 years and just give it away to our citizens and there were absolutely zero consequences, then why haven't we been doing this all along? It sounds like a pretty good system. Free money, no consequences. And the answer, of course, is that the consequences to increasing the money supply that fast by that much is inflation, as we're seeing, and that's why we don't do it all the time. That's why we only do it during emergencies. In the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve, the central banks very well know this and are actively trying to quantitatively tighten. QT. They are selling bonds in the open market to try to pull money out of the system. They put money in the system during quantitative easing, and now they're trying to pull it out during quantitative tightening. It's to decrease the money supply, to get the amount of money in circulation out of the economy. They have to do it slow so as to not to blow up the bond market, and that's obviously a discussion for another time. But slowly but surely, they are trying to get this money out of the economy. But it's a slow process. They can't do it too fast. And during that time, all of that money that was created, all of that money supply that was created over the past 2 years is all swirling around the economy. It's going to wages, it's going to goods, it's paying for higher gas prices. All of these things are feeding into our inflation rate. So we might just find that inflation is much more difficult to get control of than many of the experts are predicting. Despite all of the rate hikes, Canada's job numbers just came out showing an economy that added 108,000 jobs in October. The US, for its part, added 239,000 jobs. And this comes after all of the tightening, all of the rate hikes, all of the rhetoric that we've seen since March of this year. So inflation could very well prove very sticky. It could be around for a long time. With that said, money supply causing inflation, this is very much old news, or should be. This is common knowledge. This is on the Federal Reserve website. This is on the Bank of Canada website, Investopedia. Increase in the money supply equals inflation. However, that is not to say that the Russian invasion didn't create more inflation. Higher gas prices, again, also well known to create inflation. Supply chain issues works together with an increase in the money supply. We have an increase in the money supply and nothing to buy. So what there is to buy is going to cost more money. That pizza, if that pizza is the only thing available, the price of that pizza is going to go up. So supply chain issues definitely did cause inflation, but they did work together with the increase in the money supply. So there are other causes of inflation besides the major increase in the amount of money circulating in the economy. But the amount of money circulating is almost definitely one of the main causes of inflation that we're seeing in Canada, in the United States, throughout the world. With all of that said, we will continue to track Canada's inflation rate and its money supply on this channel as we get more information. If you want to get those updates, make sure you click like and subscribe. But for now, thanks so much for watching.